Good afternoon. So this is an in-depth case review study of 100 Connecticut families referred to Child Protective Services with three aims in mind: to examine the scope and severity of children's exposure to domestic violence, quantify the overlap between domestic violence severity and other forms of maltreatment, and test whether DV exposure severity predicts recidivism. So we know that neglect is the predominant allegation type among families referred to CPS, but about half of these children are also exposed to domestic violence. This is probably an underestimate given that CPS agencies often have suboptimal strategies for identifying DV when it exists, and many of these families are not being connected to services. We know that DV-exposed children are likely to experience other forms of adverse childhood experiences, that DV in early childhood has been described as a gateway to subsequent exposure to violence in adolescence and adulthood. And despite this overlap, CPS agencies are ill-equipped to assess risk for these other adversities because they're focused more on the allegation at hand. So we selected 100 cases randomly during a 12-month period in Connecticut from two regions, one more urban, one more rural. We extracted data from the entire history of the case, and then 12 months after what we're calling an index report, we had 4 data extractors working with us on this. Among the 100 families, 150 children were named victim in the index report. About half were female. About 40% were under the age of 6, and we saw some expected demographic differences across the two regions in Connecticut, with more white Caucasian families in the rural area. We applied offline a relatively new tool for assessing adversity severity called the Yale Vermont Adversity in Childhood Scale, the YVAX. It includes 9 maltreatment and 9 non-maltreatment related adversities rated on a 4-point scale. We had 4 expert coders and we had excellent reliability. We supplemented the YVAX with 2 additional adversity domains to better differentiate psychological and physical domestic violence. So again, on a 4-point scale, and again, achieving really good reliability. So our index reports had primarily allegations of neglect. If you look at the index reports, about 26% had domestic violence indicated in their child abuse and neglect code. That's kind of the dashboard view of a chart that is most accessible to caseworkers. However, when we did that exhaustive review of narrative and investigation documents, we actually found evidence of current domestic violence in 43% of cases, so substantially more, suggesting that there's information not being accounted for in the charts. 76% of cases had prior allegations, and many of these, again, were neglect, a portion of them substantiated. 45% of these had domestic violence in that CAN code. When we went back and did that review, we found evidence of domestic violence for 82% of cases. 28% of cases had new allegations within the 12-month period after that index report upon which we selected the cases. Again, many of these allegations of neglect. And here are data from our adversity severity ratings. The darker red reflect the more severe adversities, and you can see a good deal of variability. Notably, we were able to quantify severity of adversities even that weren't formally recognized as maltreatment. So there was some rich data in the charts that we were able to extract and make sense of. Here's a closer view of the psychological and physical DV severity scales. So a little bit more than half of the cases had psychological domestic violence rated moderate to severe. 34% had physical DV moderate to severe. And notably, more than half of cases with just allegations of neglect across their entire case history had pretty high severe levels of domestic violence exposure. This slide shows correlations between psychological and physical domestic violence severity and other forms of maltreatment and adversities, really reflecting that high degree of overlap between domestic violence exposure, which is not a formal maltreatment category in most states, and these other adversities. If we just look at children with moderate to severe domestic violence, we see that they have about double the number of types of adversity domains. So many of these children we can consider polyvictims or children exposed to cumulative adversity, and we know that there's this dose-response relationship between the number of types of adversities and a host of adverse outcomes. These children were also 2.4 times more likely to have a substantiated allegation by history, and 2.6 times more likely to have a new allegation within 12 months of the index report. So knowing something about DV severity is saying something about risk of those co-occurring adversities and recidivism. We were interested to see if any of our domestic violence indicators were associated with the department's current risk assessment score, and there weren't any associations, which is really suggesting to us that their algorithm is not sufficiently capturing this risk that's associated with domestic violence. In summary, the scope of DV exposure here was much greater than indicated in that CPS CAN coding, which is their dashboard view. It took us 4 hours to extract data from those charts, and caseworkers really only have a snapshot view. We had success in coding a number of different adversities, domestic violence, maltreatment, using data from the charts and using that coding scheme. More severe DV predicted greater severity of other forms of maltreatment, adversity, and polyvictimization. DV exposure severity also predicted subsequent reports of abuse and neglect. And what's clear is that current practice may not be optimally utilizing what is known in charts regarding domestic violence to assess risk. Luckily, Connecticut's been very open and looking to us for recommendations, and we're working with them to improve methods of documentation and extraction of domestic violence exposure information, and to develop and enhance tools to guide assessment of DV presence and severity towards increasing risk assessment accuracy. Thank you.